Coming up today on LinkedIn News Live. Time's Up was a movement across the globe to bring awareness to pervasive sexual harassment, primarily against women in the workplace. We speak with the CEO of the organization that forced many executives and leaders to hand in their resignations. Plus, a $1.9 trillion stimulus bill is passed by Congress. We'll tell you what that means for you. All that next. Hello, I'm Caroline Fairchild, and welcome to LinkedIn News Live, where the business conversation begins with you. It's March 11th, and here's a quick look at the top headlines trending right now on LinkedIn. Air travel is primed for takeoff. More states widening vaccine access. And the House passes big COVID-19 relief bill. Let's take a deeper dive into that story. The U.S. House of Representatives passed President Joe Biden's $1.9 trillion COVID relief plan, paving the way for another round of stimulus checks and additional aid for workers and businesses. The sprawling bill passed on a party line vote, with Republicans arguing that the recovery is already in progress and little to no additional spending is needed. Joining me now to discuss, as always, is Jordan Dahl. She covers small business for us here at LinkedIn. Jordan, this is a massive injection of federal stimulus, one of the biggest since the Great Depression, and it had no support from Republican lawmakers. What happens next?
You're absolutely right. So, as you mentioned at the very top, this is a revised text that came back from the Senate to the House. It passed there. It is now headed to President Biden's desk, and he is expected to sign this into law on Friday, tomorrow. Now, the headline here for viewers that they're probably waiting for is, yes, there is another round of stimulus checks in this package. As with every stimulus package, the rules for eligibility are a little bit different. So the check amount is up to $1,400. Those who are eligible are those singles who make under $75,000 a year, and couples who are jointly making under $150,000 a year.
So this is going to help just so many people who are in need right now. But I'm thinking specifically about parents and the segment that we did yesterday on the show about how parents are feeling right now. What does this bill mean specifically for them?
A lot. There is a lot in this bill aimed at helping parents who are struggling so much right now. One of the biggest news coming out of this is that there is going to be money going directly to parents. Now, this is being couched as a tax credit. In practice, it is going to show up as a check in the mail. So parents earning less than $150,000 as a couple or $112,000 as a head of household can get up to $300 per child per month. Another big change. This is going to be applicable for kids all the way up to age of 17. Now, this is a massive change for the U.S. And this puts us far more in line with our European counterparts, like in Germany, where they do actually subsidize childcare. This is going to be valid for 1 year, but the Democrats are hoping that they can make this a permanent change.
Well, that permanent change is going to impact schools as well. What in the relief plan goes specifically to schools and our infrastructure right now?
There is $130 billion earmarked for schools to help them reopen. So one thing we can all agree on right now is virtual learning is not working for kids and it's not working for parents. And so this money is going to go toward installing new ventilation systems in schools, to hiring more janitors to help keep schools clean, and supply teachers with the PPE that they have been asking for months.
And we see this dichotomy right now, Jordan, where the economy is on an upward trajectory, but there are still millions of people unemployed across the country. How is the bill going to support them?
Absolutely. There are so many people who are struggling, and there is quite a bit in this bill that is aimed at helping them in particular. So unemployment benefits have been extended through September 6th. Those who are on unemployment benefits will continue to get the extra $300 a week in addition to whatever their state is giving them per week. They'll also going to be seeing a tax break. Under this bill, the first $10,200 that people claim under unemployment is going to be tax-free, which is a huge relief for many. But the biggest change here comes down to health insurance. Viewers are very likely familiar with COBRA. This is the health insurance that is available to you after you are laid off, but it is often prohibitively expensive, and it has left millions of people in the middle of a pandemic without health insurance. Through September 6th, the U.S. government is going to be picking up the tab for those COBRA premiums. And this is going to open up health insurance to millions of Americans. For those who are watching and want to get, health insurance, they should go to healthcare.gov and check on what may be available to them. And open enrollment is available through May 15th.
Yeah, I'm sure that news is a relief for many. And Jordan, I've seen some comments and questions in the stream right now about rent and mortgages. Is there anything in the bill that will help relieve those who are just having a hard time keeping a roof over their head right now?
There is. I mean, pretty much whoever you are, there is some kind of stimulus in this bill for you. For renters, there is a $22 billion emergency rental assistance fund that is going to help renters with rent, utilities, or unpaid rent that may have been accumulating during the pandemic. Same goes for homeowners. There's a $10 billion fund for them to help with mortgage payments and utilities. But as you know, Caroline, as we've talked about, so many people have already lost their homes in this pandemic. And there is aid in this bill for them as well. Congress set aside $5 billion that is going to go toward things like converting motels into shelters and creating a voucher that is going to be given directly to those who are homeless or are in danger of becoming homeless.
Well, Jordan, I see many members in the stream very excited for Friday when Biden hopefully puts pen to paper on this stimulus. And as always, thanks for breaking it down for us here on LinkedIn News Live.
Thanks for having me.
That was Jordan Dahl. She covers small business for us here at LinkedIn. And for more tips on everything going on with small business, be sure to check out her newsletter, Big Trends in Small Business, as well as if you are looking for other conversations to follow on LinkedIn, just go to the news module to the right of your LinkedIn feed. Or if you're in mobile, you can click into that search box. In 2018, the Time's Up movement hit the scene and changed the way that Americans across the country discuss topics like gender inequity, sexual harassment, lack of diversity in the workplace, and so much more. Now, in the midst of the pandemic, these conversations continue, but against the backdrop of a global pandemic that has left an estimated 5.4 million women without jobs. Will this affect the progress that we've seen since 2018? Joining us now to discuss is Tchen. She's CEO of Time's Up. Tina, welcome to LinkedIn News Live.
Oh, glad to be here, Caroline.
All right, well, let's start with the news. Earlier this week, President Biden announced his Gender Council, which will impact every cabinet member that he has on his team in terms of their involvement. As someone who held previous positions in the Obama administration, what does this move signal to you?
Well, I was thrilled to see the executive order creating the Gender Policy Council the White House signed. I was the executive director in the Obama administration of our version of that, which was the first ever White House Council on Women and Girls, which was, like this Gender Policy Council is, a whole of government effort, not just one policy office sitting by itself in the White House, but it commanded members from every cabinet agency, every major White House office. That's what President Biden has also done with the Gender Policy Council. But, he's renamed it the Gender Policy Council, not just the White House Council on Women and Girls, to recognize what we now know 12 years later about the ways in which gender expresses itself in our population, gender fluidity, transgender, and the way gender discrimination shows up. So I'm glad to see that. It's got more resources. It will have 5 full-time staff. It's got, a real command from President Biden to address holistically across the whole government what we need for women and girls, transgender, LGBTQIA, and others in our society.
And Tina, this move by Biden to ensure that every member of his cabinet is participating in this council, it reminds me of a movement that we're seeing in corporate America, where we don't just shove diversity and inclusion efforts into a cabinet or into a closet, but we actually say this is something that's part of the whole company. Why did it take a global pandemic for us to change our approach on this? I know you've been looking at this issue for so long.
Yeah, I have. And you're right. One of the problems of the past is everything was siloed, right? Diversity and inclusion sort of sometimes sat under HR or someplace by itself. But we know that if you want to create cultures that are safe, fair, and dignified for everyone, you need to affect every part of the way a company operates. You can't just have the folks who are doing hiring over in one part of the company not paying attention, the folks who are managing day to day not paying attention, or the folks who are doing pay and promotions or doing the firings. All of those jobs frequently were siloed from each other. And only one person doing diversity inclusion, often a quarter by themselves. And I think now, both with what has happened with Time's Up in calling attention to sexual harassment and the need to build better workplace cultures, I saw it happening with the war for talent that companies are engaged in and realizing they cannot leave behind women and people of color and LGBTQIA and disabled workers, or else they're going to lose the war for talent. And now with the pandemic, realizing even more, to build a sustainable company, you need to have everything pulling in the same direction. And also, like what we've seen in the last year around racial reckoning after the murder of George Floyd, companies are really grappling with what does it mean to be truly anti-racist across your entire organization. That means, like so many other things, I spent my early part of my career as a corporate lawyer. Tone at the top matters when you're trying to like move things forward as a priority for your company. This is as important to a company as that new plant you're going to build, the new technology you're making investments in, your R&D budget. And I suggest companies in the C-suite and boards need to treat it just like a corporate imperative as you do so many other things.
Well, let's dive into that war on talent a little bit more, Tina. You mentioned that the companies just don't want to lose talent, but we're talking right now during Women's History Month, and we're seeing just millions of working women leaving the workforce right now. I'm curious, as you've been sitting back and reading the headlines and talking with leaders across industries, what worries you the most in terms of the state of working women right now?
No, absolutely. First of all, look, you mentioned it at the top. Over 5 million women have left the workforce in the last year. An overwhelming number of them tell us that it's because of caregiving responsibilities. We are now at a point where women's labor force participation in the United States is at levels we have not seen since the 1980s. So we're on the verge of wiping out decades of progress for women in the workforce. And that's not just at entry-level positions. It's happening on the women who are on their way to the C-suite, women who are on their way to becoming senior partners at accounting firms and law firms. So we're not just losing folks who are just coming into the workforce. We're losing those senior women who we were counting on to actually try to shift the dynamics at the top of companies. That's so important. And what's the reason? So many of us tell us they cannot manage the caregiving responsibilities, not just childcare, but elder care, their own care. We are in the United States, one of only 2 countries in the world that does not have a national paid leave policy. Now, one of the great things about the $1.9 trillion rescue package that you talked about at the top is it also includes emergency paid leave support for small businesses, a voluntary tax credit. If you're a small business up to 500 employees who wants to provide paid leave for your employees, you can get a tax credit. But that's not what we advocates would call is real paid leave, meaning a national, permanent, comprehensive paid leave policy that covers all workers. We need that. We also need more investments in childcare, more investments in in-home services for elder care, and more support for caregivers themselves so that they have a fair wage and they have labor protections. Most caregivers live outside of our formal economy. We need to bring them into the formal economy. And here's the other thing to this all, Caroline, in this important moment. We issued a study last month from Time's Up, our impact lab, which demonstrated that if you make these investments, a comprehensive caregiving investment in infrastructure, you create jobs. It's stimulative to the economy at this moment. We estimated if you invest $77 billion a year, which was the Biden-Harris campaign promise, you can create 2 million new jobs every year. You can generate $220 billion of new economic activity every year. And that doesn't even count the fact that you are creating jobs that allows someone else to go to work and also stimulate the economy. So as we talk about rebuilding better in this next phase of recovery and the kinds of infrastructure that we need, I will submit to you that investing in a caregiving infrastructure is even more shovel ready and even more stimulative than the next road or bridge that we're talking about investing in.
Well, Tina, I'm glad that you brought that up. And actually, just yesterday, we had Rasmus and Johnny, who's pushing forward this Marshall Plan for moms right now. And we saw just a ton of chatter in the comments from members saying that they don't believe that a caregiving economy will create jobs. So for those who are still skeptical, there are many out there who don't think that any sort of stimulus for parents, for moms, a caregiving infrastructure of any sort will actually further the economy. What can you say to convince them other than those amazing stats?
Well, I will tell you at Time's Up, we've run the numbers, right? We've run the economic analysis that refutes that demonstrates it. And then I would suggest this is one of those things that you can look to your own experience. The universality of the way the pandemic has hit everyone and the pressures that they feel, whether you are a senior executive or you are an entry-level person, of school being out, trying to manage at home, having relatives be sick in your household and loved ones, and then still trying to get on Zoom when you need to, or actually go to work if you have to show up in person at work. I think everyone is now experiencing those pressures, and you can see for yourself what it would mean if we had a true infrastructure in this country, as they have in so many other countries, where there is adequate, affordable childcare centers everywhere, where there is an adequate supply of caregivers who are well trained, who can come into your home, who you can feel safe leaving your loved ones with. If you had the flexibility at work to work at home when you need to, or have paid leave when you need to, you can see how you could be more productive. I think everyone is experiencing that. That's why, as an advocate in this for so many years, Carolyn, I think we are at a tipping point where we can actually really rebuild an American caregiving infrastructure. And here's the thing, this is a global audience. We are not competitive. US-based companies that have to be figuring it out themselves, US workers who are having to figure it out themselves, are at a competitive disadvantage to global competitors who live in countries where there is a government-sponsored, a collective effort to try to address caregiving needs.
Right. Tina, I'm going to go ahead and say hello to some members who are joining us in the stream. We have Sarah from Seattle, Paul from California, Stephen from New Jersey, and Farah from Indonesia. Thanks for joining us here on LinkedIn News Live. Tina, I wanted to get your take on, I want to take us back. We're a year into this pandemic, if you can believe it. Today is the actual day that this was identified as a national health crisis. In terms of when this pandemic started, did you have a good understanding of the impact it would have on women in particular? And if it wasn't in the beginning, when did you say, this is going to be bad?
Well, I have to say that I was worried from the start because, women are vulnerable workers, and they were before the pandemic started. I've been working on these issues around working families for many years now. I had just joined Time's Up as a full-time president and CEO in November of 2019 as we were heading into this pandemic. We already knew that companies needed to do more and better to attract and keep their talent.
My mic. It says I don't have my mic.
Right. So that was one of the things that we needed, absolutely we knew that we needed to do. And then early on in the pandemic, we saw, women are overrepresented in the industries that were getting hit, like hospitality and restaurants. They were, overrepresented in frontline caregiving kinds of jobs, like physician assistants and nurses and orderlies. So they were getting hit at both ends, getting laid off and putting themselves at risk. But now we know, we have the data, with 5 million having left the job market. In this last jobs report from last Friday, while the overall unemployment rate came down to 6% more generally for folks, Black women and Latinx women are 1.5 times higher, their unemployment rate. So this idea that Republican lawmakers have that the economy is recovering and everything's fine, that is not happening for Black and Latinx women in particular, and women in general.
And I want to get your take, Tina, on a recent survey that we had on LinkedIn, where you found that more than 1/3, this is such a startling statistic, 1/3 of working women said that their career is on pause at the moment. That just signals to me just all the progress that we've made is just going down the tubes right now. What needs to change to bring back the momentum that we've seen right now with working women?
Well, one thing I can point, folks to is we actually last summer, in the midst of the pandemic, at Time's Up, we convened, DEI experts and other leaders from over 24 companies, and we put a lot of their learning together in a leader's guide for equity and inclusion during crisis. And folks can text the word leaders to 30644. It's open sourced, or you can find it on our website at timesupnow.org, which gives some really practical things that the leaders of any company and any organization can pay attention to address equity and inclusion in the workplace. And I will say, look, on all these things we've been talking about around caregiving, companies don't need to wait for Congress to act. Right? Companies can actually take the steps you need to right now to create a better corporate culture within your company, to make your company more attractive to women who are out there seeking jobs, to make it work for your existing women employees so you do not lose their talent and their skills and what they already know about your company, and you can increase their productivity. So providing things like paid leave, providing things like flexible scheduling, making sure that if people are working remote, that they have the technology at home that they need to. If you're bringing people back to work, but not everybody, figure out what to do with your empty space, and maybe you can use that as on-site childcare, and not just for preschool age kids, but we now know that kids, high school and middle school kids also need, some form of care and some place to do their Zoom school or be after school. Those are things where employers can have a stake in what their employees need as well. And that will be so key to making sure we reverse this decline, which I'm very worried about in women in the workplace.
Well, Tina, one of the reasons that I really wanted to have you on was to connect for us the work that you're doing at Time's Up and that critical work that companies need to be doing right now on the ground. I actually want to bring up something that you said recently in an interview with Cheddar. You said in order to combat things like sexual harassment that Time's Up focuses on, we need women, people of color, LGBTQ disabled workers, and at every level of our workplaces. Tina, why is that? Connect the dots for us in terms of why the work that you're doing there is so critical to representation across levels in corporate America.
Well, look, Time's Up was started at a moment of sexual harassment, and our first initiative, the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund, was critical to providing legal support and PR support for survivors who were speaking out, something that didn't exist even though it's been 3 decades since sexual harassment was outlawed as a matter of federal employment law. But here's the thing, sexual harassment is a symptom. It's a symptom of a toxic workplace already that doesn't have sufficient representation at all levels, that doesn't have a culture that respects workers and includes them in the work of your company, that values them, that has ethics and values at the core of how you operate. And that's why at Time's Up, we stand for survivor justice, and we also work for a world where sexual harassment doesn't happen in the first place. And that means doing things like working at equity inclusion, making sure we have a fair wage for everyone, that we're making sure that we are building workplace cultures that are not toxic, not bullying, not based on, who you can beat down in the job, but lift them up in your job and include your employees in the work that you're doing. You will find you will have a more profitable, more sustainable, company in the long run.
And I want to go back to your early days with the Time's Up organization and just the general rhetoric around diversity and inclusion and how people were talking about these issues in the workplace. Have you seen movement, particularly around this summer, and just the reckoning against systemic racism that we've seen in terms of how corporate leaders are not just talking about these issues, but acting on them?
Absolutely. No, I mean, I've seen, an openness and an understanding on the part of corporate CEOs of these issues. And some of them really had their eyes opened through this process, starting with sexual harassment and understanding for the first time, some of the stray comments. Remember, not all sexual harassment happens at the Harvey Weinstein end of the spectrum, where there's actual sexual, physical assault happening. It also happens in the everyday microaggressions, the little comments, the asking someone out for dinner, the telling the joke that you think is funny and a little off color, but it really is landing for your women employees or your Black employees in a very different way. There's an awareness now people have that, oh, was I doing this? And wanting to change and realizing the impact it has, because you've now seen companies that have gone into real crisis when their CEOs have had to leave, right? Or they have had actually toxic cultures inside and their workers walk out on the job. This millennial workforce, I will say our young people are voting with their feet, both in the places where they want to work and the places they're buying goods and services from. And they want to see values lived out in those companies. And I would say to those CEOs, and we know 93% of them are men, so they need to own this and be part and be allies in this change. That don't be afraid to have this conversation. It can be intimidating because, none of us were raised understanding these issues and having the language and having the ability to interact. And I've talked to many CEOs who are worried. They're just afraid. They're like, I don't want to say something wrong. I really want to help, but I don't want to say something wrong. I would say still learn about the issues, enter into the conversation. And for advocates like me, I always say we have to provide grace for those conversations to happen, for somebody to sometimes say the wrong thing in a moment, but to learn from it and not to, we are not about cancel culture here at Time's Up. We are about bringing people in and helping them learn and together realizing we don't have all the answers. Look, if we had all the answers, these issues would have been dealt with years ago. We're still learning about how to address them, and we need to do that collectively with sort of good faith and goodwill and grace to one another.
Well, Tina, speaking of those challenging conversations, there are 2 trends that are most worrisome to me when we talk about talking about sexual harassment in the workplace. One, millions of people, they just need their jobs right now in order to be able to go home and provide for their families. And 2, a lot of us are doing this. We're in separate rooms, but as you said, that doesn't mean that there isn't inappropriate activity happening. So for people who are struggling to find work right now, or for people who are in jobs where, say, they might not know if, did that comment from that boss, was that inappropriate? How do they speak out? How do they find their voice?
Well, I will say that anybody who feels that they have been just, been the object of sexual harassment, that's what the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund is there for, and including for you to call and say, did I experience this or not? To get connected with a lawyer, tell your story, and get the advice on whether that really was something or not. And it's okay if it wasn't, because it's okay to ask the question and try to figure it out, or go to your HR department or go elsewhere, to sort of get some help. I've had that happen where people just call and said, that just happened, and was that gender discrimination or not? Because sometimes you're not sure, and that's okay. As I said, this is something we're all learning our way through. But I will say it is hard when you're looking for a job and you just need to get that paycheck. That's why we exist as advocates, because we are trying to make sure that we're setting the structures in place so that every workplace is a place that is safe for you, and you don't have to feel like you have to make that compromise around your safety and dignity to get work. That's why this is a very big movement. We need to get to a place where when you're looking for a job, you don't have to worry that you're entering into a job where you somehow have to put yourself at risk.
Well, Tina, I'm such a fan of you. I'm such a fan of your work. Before I let you go, you're on the front lines combating these issues every day. What gets you up in the morning? What are some of we've talked so much about the problems. What are some of the silver linings and solutions that you're seeing that you hope the members in the stream can see as well?
Well, I will tell you, the silver lining really is, Carolyn, as bad as things are with this pandemic, the fact that it hit everybody in the same way, in so many, like, it doesn't matter if you were at the top of the company or not, you had to get home and you had to work home and your kids were out of school. And now I see sort of a universality of experience here that creates a true opportunity for a transformational change to occur, I think, in our economy, in how we look at workers, how we invest within one another, how we can build a better economy that is based on more, foundational principles of fairness and equity and dignity and inclusion for all. And that will actually, I think, make us a better economy and stronger across the board. So I think we really are on the verge of being able to have as large a transformational moment as the New Deal was, right? This is our moment for our generation to make that kind of change as they came out of the Great Depression and transformed the way we support one another in our society in the New Deal. We have the moment right now to come out of this pandemic and recession and transform for the 21st century the way our economy and our workplaces work. And honestly, it is exhausting, but that gets me out of bed in the morning.
Well, as I've said almost every day in this pandemic, the night is darkest before the dawn. And Tina, thank you so much for being part of that bright light and for joining us here on LinkedIn News Live.
Oh, thank you, Carolyn.
That was Tina Tchen. She's CEO of the Time's Up movement, talking to us about how the Time's Up movement has transformed amid a global pandemic. All right, tomorrow at 12 Eastern on the LinkedIn news page, my colleague Andrew Seaman will be on with Get Hired Live, chatting with Stanford behavioral scientist BJ Fogg. They'll be talking about your everyday routine and what can change to maximize the time you spend job searching. I'm Caroline Fairchild. Thanks so much for joining us on LinkedIn News Live.